Redditors who have served in submarines, what is something not many people know about being inside one? Served on a Virginia class. The best way I can describe the smell is that of a dirty McDonald's. It's due to the CO2 absorbent. We all go nose blind to it in a few days, but the smell gets into all our clothes real bad. Their airflow is actually really good. There are fans that keep everything circulating. 0.5-minute showers are a thing. The reason is creating potable water is a slow, somewhat noisy process. The other reason is discharging dirty water is also a noisy event. Our only communication with the outside world is through email. There is no internet access. The ship periodically downloads everything then distributes it. Upsetting emails are withheld until the boat comes into port, so the sailor can continue to function until it is possible to get a flight home. When the boat is on mission where stealth is mandatory, there might not be any communication at all for over a month. On a Virginia class submarine, a 5-minute shower is turn water on to get wet, turn water off, lather up with soap, turn water on, rinse soap off, turn water off, then squeegee all 4 walls. No one was ever in a rush when the water was off or squeegeeing the walls. Yes, radio screened our emails. Served on a first flight Los Angeles class. It's small, really small, like I got to tour a ballistic missile sub that my friend from nuke school was on, and I was practically getting agoraphobic. Adding to it being small, it's also in some ways bigger than you think. There's all sorts of nooks and crannies in the engine rooms where you wouldn't think people would fit, but between cleaning and trying to find a place to get a nap in, you find a lot of interesting spots. One particular spot was tagged by one of our lab techs, and as he was upwards of 6 feet 6 inches and 250 pounds, I still have no idea how he got in there. The engine room is filled with oil smoke. Picture getting a humidifier and putting clean engine oil in it, and you have a good idea of what being on watch back aft is like. Put some oil in your coffee as well for the true submarine experience. Submarines don't just have fans for ventilation, they have bigger ZAC units in addition for keeping the boat habitable. Something many people definitely don't know is how hot it gets in a tropical climate on a sunny day when some of the AC units are down for maintenance and the remaining ones break. I was on duty that day and had to live/sleep on board, and temps were upwards of 130 F. I was literally soaked in my own sweat, and we were slightly salting the pitchers of water we were drinking because we were just losing so much from sweating. There are hatches which have hatch doors, one on the hull and one from the airlock, created by the 2 doors to the inside of the ship. These are technically escape hatches, although as any submariner will tell you, they're for senators not sailors, referring to the fact that they're there to make people feel more comfortable and satisfy a legal requirement. But if you think you're probably just going to die because the majority of the ocean is deeper than feasible to escape from. Anyways, for testing, every once in a while the boat dives to test depth, as deep as it's allowed to go, and opens the inner hatch to inspect the outer hatch under pressure that deep. It's safe enough as you could imagine, but seeing the single hatch door separating you from crushing amounts of seawater is a humbling experience, and not something I think most people would know about. I do mean agoraphobic, not claustrophobic. Ballistic missile subs are super roomy compared to fast attack submarines. I forgot about the dreams. You never truly escape the boat when attached, even when asleep. In my most memorable moment, there was a zombie invasion of Guam, and myself and a few other people got to a plane which I knew how to fly somehow and took off towards the mainland. As we were just flying over the ocean, a senior chief from squadron burst into the cockpit yelling, "Where's your procedure? You can't operate without a procedure. AHHH. Before wrestling the controls from me and crashing us all into the ocean, killing everyone on board. This is not too far off from how some people in the Navy operate." From one of the last of the Franklin class boomers, your feet feel like they grip the ground when you come ashore. When a boomer comes in after a 3-month patrol, you'll find the base movie house with 10 single sailors watching a 2-month movie, and while they're the only ones in the theater, odds are they'll be sitting in seats next to each other in the same row. Being 3 months out, receiving occasional family grams, shares throughout the entire fleet, and having edited snippets of news delivered to you via a single piece of posted paper. When you come back and you recognize no movies, buildings have changed, gov's changed, it's pretty much a time machine. Point being, in the rack in rough water is like the best hammock being rocked ever. The medic has equipment to do everything from open heart surgery to pulling teeth and the manuals on how to do it. When you do angles and dangles in the missile compartment room and you sit on a woven wet trash bag, you go very fast and there are a lot of pipes flying by your knees. If the compass is off the quartermaster and gets a wrong time for sunrise, when you go to periscope depth, the sun will beam through the periscope over the con's head like a laser beam around the room, and you'll hear some amazing curses as the con swings around in a circle verifying no boats or other hidden in the surf nearby. The missile control center has a ledge on the operating control panel which makes an excellent footrest point due to the floating ground in the ship hull. If you're in the sonar shack and you plug in and place the handheld demagnetizer against the ship's hull, the walls will literally vibrate. Point. If you shut the toilet lids too loud, because sound can travel through thermal layers a good 50 miles, they will be taken away from you. Point. If they are blowing the sanitary tanks out to sea and you pissed off the A-gangers, they won't warn you they're blowing tanks. If you're on the toilet and will sneak blowing sand signs on the stall doors. The toilets have a lever that runs water down the rim and another one with a big ball valve in the bottom. Space is a premium on a sub, with a whole lot of pressure in the tank, and the only thing between the pressure, a lot of sanitary contents, and you is that ball valve. If you don't notice tiny little bubbles in the bottom of the bowl, when you pull the lever to the ball valve you will get sheet rammed up your nose, eyelids, entire body, and when the A-gangers point to the signs it'll be you who cleans it. Point. Nukes have the sample bottles that make perfect spittoons for chewing tobacco. If any chewing tobacco spittoon spills and travels towards the battery compartment, it's the job of the highest ranking petty officer in the cruise lounge to dam the flow with the body of the lowest ranking member present. Point. Never ever piss off the cook. Point. Lots more, but sea stories are boring. Point. Edit. 30 years ago, things have changed. Point. Edit. I annotated post due to some confusion regarding terminology used. Point. Edit. Note, a boomer is slang for a sub which has the capacity to carry nuclear missiles. I.e., nuclear missiles go boom. The sub is a boomer. They are the biggest subs as the sub is basically chopped in half and a large self-contained missile compartment for the nuclear missiles is sandwiched between the forefront and aft back. Point. Edit. Change the correct class of boat. Edit. Something I'd forgotten about until I started thinking about it and haven't seen here. A little over 1 to 2 months without pulling into shore. Nobody gets sick again until we pull in. This is for boomers who stay out 3 months only. Can't speak for fast attacks. My understanding is that the infected pool is small enough, the electrostatic filters etc strong enough, we were closed off from any outside new vectors enough, that people's immune systems catch up to the viruses before viruses can mutate after 1 to 2 months in. Nobody really paid much attention to it, but it did come up in conversation with people new to boats who noticed it. My dad's story. Point. He served on the US Kentucky way back when, and due to some logistics error, all they had to eat was basically beef stroganoff. Point. He's like, it's not that bad, I can live with this. But when you're on a sub and you're cramped, tempers run wild. Point. They start fighting with the metal knives and forks, so command takes them away and gives them plastic knives and forks. Fighting stops for a bit, but then tempers flare and they fight with the plastic, so command takes them away and have them plastic spoons to eat beef stroganoff with. By this time my dad is sick of this shit. People start fighting again though, and my poor E3 dad wasn't about that life, but command was like, yeah, so you guys have to eat with your hands now. It's been around 30 years and he refuses to even smell beef stroganoff. Last time we made it was in 2013 and we were on vacation. He came into the house, looked at us eating the stroganoff, and said, I'm ordering pizza for me. Good times. Way late to the party, but I'll add a couple of items. You/Auckland Hellbent already gave a good summary, so I'll keep it short. Point. I was on Madison class boomers 40 years ago, so this is pretty old news. First up, there's no team on Earth like a submarine crew. One example, admittedly carefully crafted, is Store's load day. Worst, most ass busting day of your life. You're getting ready to go on patrol for 10 weeks. There are 2 hatches barely big around enough for one large grown man to climb down through. Every item that the 143-man crew will consume has to go down through those 2 hatches, passed hand to hand from sailor to sailor. All the food, paper towels, toilet paper, cleaning items, you name it. Tons of materials, all packed small enough to fit through those hatches. On that day, every last person on the boat, from the captain on down to the lowest recruit, participated beginning to end. No complaints, just get it done. Second up, don't fuck with someone on submarines, especially early in patrol. People have 10 whole weeks to scheme their revenge. That could be a whole thread all by itself. Best example I ever heard of, one of the chief petty officers loved Snickers bars, had a small stash. One of the other CPOs stole one on day 2 or 3 of patrol. The thief then bragged about how he was going on a diet. The victim thought about it and decided the offender's belt was the best place to attack. Now, anyone in the military knows about those web belts that are infinitely adjustable. One size fits all, just cut off the excess webbing when you buy a new one and you're good to go. The victim, once a week, would trim about 1/4 inches to a 1/2 inch off the thief's belt. The guy kept losing pounds, starving himself, but his goddamn belt kept getting tighter and tighter. When we returned from patrol and tied up to the tender, the victim gave the thief an envelope with all the little pieces of his belt in it. My favorite memory? After several years of service, I got senior enough and trusted enough, so I got to hang out with the older guys who knew what it was about. We were on maneuvering watch, meaning traveling on the surface, until we got past the continental shelf, where we could dive. The chief of the boat told me to come topside with him and help secure the deck from maneuvering watch. We strapped into safety harnesses and walked the deck, turning down the cleats. We got to the bow, nothing but a harness and a rope keeping us from disappearing into the sea. And looked back at the sleek sub hull. The sun was going down, and it was just gorgeous. He said, "Let's have a cigarette before we go below." We lit up and looked at the beautiful world around us for the last time in 10 weeks, and right then a pod of dolphins started pacing the boat. We watched them for about 2 cigarettes, then went below and closed the hatch. Blowing the sheeter on yourself. 616 class sailor here. When the sanitary tank was full, the auxiliary man on watch would secure the heads to pressurize the sanitary tank to above sea pressure, 75 C, to empty it out. During that time, any crew member not fully in possession of their senses might occasionally stumble into the head, take a leak or dump, and flush. The flushing valve was a 3 to 4 inch ball valve that connected the toilet bowl directly to the sanitary tank directly below. This would vent the pressurized air in the tank below into the compartment, covering the newly awakened sailor in his own excrement. Everyone up forward on the ship would hear this. Of course, the poor victim would have to clean the whole mess up. On hump night, halfway through the patrol, the sailor who did the best job would be awarded the Golden Sheeter Award, a toilet seat painted gold point. I remember one guy talking about getting sheet out from under his eyelids. Now that I've read the comments, a few more things. There's a machine that makes fresh water out of seawater that supplies the whole boat. When it breaks, there is a backup, but its capacity is significantly lower than the primary. That means, while the primary is out of service, no one can take showers. I was a mechanic who owned the primary, and the only time I was treated like royalty on a submarine was while I was fixing it. You can smoke cigarettes on a submarine, but it was either 1 or 2 people at a time, and only in one place on the whole boat, and that room smelled like death. Got diesel poured all over it. Though you could smoke cigarettes, you couldn't bring any aerosol cans on board. Lots of gay comments and questions. I'm gay, but never did anything underway, mainly because there's no privacy and you could get in serious trouble, demoted, lose half your pay for months, restricted to the boat for months, extra duty, and when I was in, don't ask don't tell, was still in effect, so you'd get kicked out of the Navy. There were several other gay people on my boat, I'd say 10% of the crew, which I think is higher than the national population. Someone mentioned valuables, and the only time I saw someone get the sheet kicked out of them was when a guy got caught stealing out of someone's rack. You have no personal space on a sub, so all of your stuff is in a pan below your bed. If you are dumb enough to steal on a sub, prepare to get the beating of a lifetime. It was reported to the captain as him falling down the stairs. The captain didn't ask questions. I'm the reason that e-cigs are not allowed on US submarines anymore. Point. When you first arrive at the boat as a new underway buddy, you get to do what they call cranking. You clean all the dishes and galley equipment. Also, you get to be the one who takes all the trash on board and smashes it in a hydraulic press to make these nice little cans to save space. Points. So here I come smashing trash like a good nub. I put an armful of trash into the smasher, pull the valve, and then turn around to grab another handful. I hear a pop, and then a constant hiss, so I turn around, and the entire trash compactor is a ball of fire. 30 minutes of firefighting later, they come to find out that some faking mouth breather had put an e-cig battery in the trash, and I smashed the fuck out of it. LiPo batteries don't like that, so it blew up. Several weeks later, no more e-cigs on boats. You're welcome guys. Also, this happened on halfway night for those of you who know what that is. When a 1MC comes over about a fire from the TDU, everyone thought it was a joke. My friend served on the US Santa Fe. While I never asked too much, I got glimpses into sub-life. Cigarettes and chewing tobacco are super valuable when they are submerged for a while. So much so one guy on the sub would regularly collect butts and stuff and remake cigarettes and sell them. Gambling was a huge thing. So much so that some people would end a tour of duty being in deep debt. Which is funny because they didn't have the money directly on them. He said one guy was so in the hole he very nearly went missing when they docked. It's small. Very small. Sleep is hard to come by. And this is all compounded when they are submerged for days on end. Going really deep is scary shit. There was one time where they were stuck on the bottom of the ocean near the North Pole. They made it out, but damn. One time, while they were overseas they were mistakenly taken for a fishing boat by pirates. Needless to say the pirates were not prepared for boarding a surfaced sub with machine guns. They promptly surrendered. I doubt this story ever made it to any papers or news outlets, and that's all I can remember. But it sounded like a crazy sheet. Edit. None of these stories or instances may be true, and perhaps were influenced by the person. And it goes without saying that I sure as shit didn't serve on a sub. That's for much more brave people than I, but I also have no reason to believe these were all lies. LA class here. One of the things I haven't seen here yet is drills. Sailors will lose a lot of sleep over casualty drills. When casualties are announced, you have to go from a deep sleep state to all engines firing in a matter of seconds, to hop out of the rack, throw on your clothes and fight the casualty. I couldn't tell you how many days I got 3 hours of sleep and was still expected to stand an 8-hour watch. Also, healthcare is a joke on a submarine. There is one enlisted corpsman on the ship that doesn't have a medical degree and only the training the Navy provided them, mostly for emergency medical assistance. If you have any kind of illness, they will treat the symptoms with over-the-counter drugs and try to sweep any submarine disqualifying illnesses under the rug for the sake of mission readiness. Everything is more important than sleep. I was told several times while I was still qualifying that if I got more than 5 hours of sleep a night, it was too much and I should spend that time working on qualification. Storage space is incredibly valuable. If you are hot racking, you have 2/3 of the bedpan you sleep on top of for storage, which if I had to guess, is about 4'x to 4 inches for the 2/3 for a 3+ month underway. Berthing smells awful. There is always at least one stinky guy on the ship, whose rack you can smell from 10 feet away. Chances are that at one point, every submariner has slept in a rack next to the torpedoes. This becomes a problem if you are a light sleeper, because torpedo men are generally loud as hell, and you will often not be able to sleep in your rack due to evolutions happening in the torpedo room. If the crew does not like you, chances are they will try to make you tap by making your life miserable. Tapping refers to attempting suicide or going to dock saying you have suicidal thoughts. This is often accomplished by making your qualifications more difficult than your peers, waking you up to perform menial tasks, or waiting until you have gone to the rack to inform you of things you forgot to do, or even didn't know you had to do, to deprive you of sleep. Broken equipment can make your life miserable. In a personal story of mine, our refrigeration plant broke and was unable to be repaired until we pulled back into port. All of our food went bad and stank up the boat until we were able to dispose of it, and the crew was eating rice and canned food for nearly a month. My father served as an engineer on board both HMS Suburb and Scepter, which were nuclear-powered hunter-killers during the 70s and 80s. When he first joined as a junior rating, he would sleep next to the reactor. Each year he would be tested for radioactivity, and each year he would be over the specified limit. Instead of transferring him, they would just increase the limit for the next year. Years later we took a tour of a nuclear power station in Wales. Between each section we'd all have to pass through a checkpoint with a Geiger counter to make sure we were all okay. Without fail my dad would set off the alarms and people would lose their shit and he'd just go, "I'm fine. I've even got 5 kids." Other stuff. Food was much better than on surface ships. If you're gonna lock a bunch of guys in a tin can underwater for 6 months, you better keep them happy. For the same reason as above, the relationship between ranks was more relaxed. Friction between people is much more of a problem in such tight confines. His boats were mainly tasked with Cold War stuff. Despite some article the other day about there being only one sub battle during the Cold War, there was a lot that went on that was unreported. There was one incident where my dad's boat was rammed by a Russian sub and lost its conning tower and had to limp home to Scotland. It was reported as an accident with a fishing boat. As a child, one of my earliest memories was of being terrified walking along the deck of my dad's sub so we could have Christmas dinner on board before they left for the next few months. Years later we took a tour of a nuclear power station in Wales. Between each section we'd all have to pass through a checkpoint with a Geiger counter to make sure we were all okay. Without fail my dad would set off the alarms and people would lose their shit and he'd just go, "I'm fine. I've even got 5 kids." Physiologist here. The only way this would be possible is if your dad ingested radioactive calcium, phosphorus, or other heavy metal isotopes that are incorporated into bone. Even at that, said isotopes would have to be gamma emitting to get back out through his soft tissue and into the radiation detector. The amount of gamma radiation incorporated into bone required to set off a radiation detector would be enormous. In short, bullshit. Your dad would have died long before he was hot enough to walk around setting off radiation detectors. If this really happened, the most likely explanation would be that your dad lived or worked around a source of radiation, and this contaminating radiation was in his clothes. This could happen as a result of working in an industrial setting in which dust was created containing radioactive materials, or if he lived in a house that was contaminated with radon gas, which does happen. It could also have happened if your dad was undergoing medical imaging studies and or treatments for cancer in which radioactive substances are injected into his body, making him radioactive for a short period of time, days at best. I was on a submarine for a week or so for an exercise. What I remember, lobster. Lots of lobster. We ate really well on board. I was given a top bunk that had a big pipe running lengthwise over the bed and very close to it. I had to slide into the bed under the pipe, and in order to turn over, I would have to climb out of bed and back into it again. Part of the exercise involved going to test depth, which was pretty deep, thousands of feet, maybe. As we dove deeper, the titanium steel hull made popping and cracking noises, and it was disconcerting. The captain was nervous during the whole dive, and that didn't make any of us feel much better. As a visitor, I got to go up on the bridge while we were traveling out to sea, and it was as cool as they say. I felt like I was in a war movie. The sub was in Norfolk, and my parents lived close by, so my dad picked me up when we returned. He had also been in the Navy and wanted to see a modern sub. All he could talk about on the way home was how much I smelled like a mine. The officers were unragged, and you could tell it wore them down. That said, the camaraderie was better than on the surface ships I had been stationed on. Not me, but a flatmate's cousin who was on a sub for a couple of years told me quite a few interesting stories. I don't know the class, but it was a pretty old boat. Personal space was non-existent. He said they stacked shifts so that they didn't even have their own bunk. 3 dudes would share one as shifts rotated. They each had a small drawer for personal effects, and one of the most popular personal items was a pillowcase. He was one of the nuclear technicians and took a few grainy pics of the nuclear reactor. I'm pretty sure that wasn't allowed, but it was pretty cool. The thing looked like a fridge with a few dozen matrix style tubes running in and around the thing. He said that at full demand, the sub would only use about 4% of the electricity the reactor was capable of producing. The thing also had some kind of a leak on one of the emergency pressure relief valves. Did I mention it was an old one? It wasn't a bad leak, a couple drips a day, but it was leaking radioactive water that the nuclear techs were exposed to on the daily, and eventually it would make its way to the ocean. None of his higher ups would do anything about it, so one day at port he got fed up and emailed CNN. Someone eventually got back to him, and he ended up having a telephone interview with a reporter. They were off the coast of Japan when the story hit, and Japan threw an absolute tantrum as of course this sub was leaking radioactive shit into their waters. He said he heard his officers saying a few things that indicated they were trying to figure out who leaked it, but he got away, and the leak got fixed. I'd feel bad about telling his secrets, but the last I heard he was doing time for distributing child pornography, so fuck that dude. For the most part, they're pretty clean. We clean for about 8 to 10 hours a week in port, 30 plus hours a week at sea. However, there is still some pretty disgusting stuff on board. Personally, I've had sheet up to my elbows and also been drenched in some pretty thick liquid that was a mix of blood and rotten seafood. We have a few sanitary tanks on board for holding water until we can safely discharge it. A couple of the tanks are discharged by pressurizing them with air and blowing them overboard. When it's done, you need to depressurize it, and, since air is a commodity, you vent the tanks back into the sub's atmosphere. You can basically taste the sheet in the air. Water is another precious commodity, so if you have the water running for more than a minute or two in the shower, expect to get yelled at. The jokes about submariners being gay aren't exactly true, though people do become a lot more affectionate, especially when deployed. It ain't gay if you're underway. Hugging, cuddling, stroking people's faces, as grabbing, over the pants HJs, etc. The air in the sub, along with everything that absorbs smells, like clothes, smells like our chemical CO2 scrubber, amine. It's kinda similar in smell to old cat piss. You stop noticing it after a day or two, but as soon as you pull into port and leave the boat for a day, it's really easy to smell. Hot racking is still a thing. 3 people get assigned to 2 racks, beds, so you split your belongings between them, each person getting a third of each rack to store their stuff. Most people don't change their linens, usually only using their own pillowcase and blanket, so you wind up sharing sheets with 2 other people for a couple months. Hopefully they're cleanish people. Also, it's perfectly normal and expected not to shower every day. The longest I've gone is about 5 days, but I know people who went almost 2 weeks between showers. Served on an Ohio class for 5 years. It's an interesting life, to be sure. Those are some of the best years I've ever had. We have 9-man bunk rooms. You get used to it. Your bunk has a curtain for privacy. We had a guy get really religious and didn't want to be tempted to beat his meat in his rack, so he removed the rack curtain. Funny thing is, he still did it. We'd hear him and see a slight shadow moving at night, but if you called him out he'd get real defensive about it. Weird dude. He was super proud to tell everyone one day that he jizzed while he took a massive dump. That became known as the immaculate ejaculate. I'm sure others have mentioned the showers we take. Get wet, turn water off, soap up, rinse off. We have to make our own water, and it has to drain to a tank that gets pumped overboard. Conserve, conserve, conserve. The food is the best in the Navy, but it still could be improved. It suffers from a dire lack of fiber. Much of it has to be processed / canned / dried, but a vast amount of money is wasted on making crappy cookies, bland sheet cakes, subpar pies, etc. If they saved the money and made a really good dessert every few days, it'd make more sense. Then again, I don't understand why people need to eat dessert with every meal. It's not as claustrophobic as people make it out to be. Our sub is very large. We have a lounge where we can play cards, video games, watch movies, etc. I always brought a laptop with me. I've gone 90+ days without seeing the real sun, only through the periscope. It really makes you appreciate things like full showers, a comfy couch, true privacy, not just a curtain, and a good jog outdoors. I've got more if people want. I served on board the US Philadelphia, SSN 690, before she was decommissioned from 2004 to 2009. You might have heard about this little mishap during Hurricane Katrina. Where do I begin? Take a deep breath. The boat is like being locked in a basement for 6 months. No windows, sheety fluorescent lighting, and nothing but seafoam green and bilge grey as far as the eye can see. I got less radiation per month than an airline pilot or lifeguard. They allowed smoking on board. There were 2 smoke pits, but only one was open at a time and only 2 people were allowed to puff in front of a filtered intake vent at a time. After meal times, the line would often back up 30 to 40 people deep. Furthermore, I saw that the CO2 scrubbing chemical was mentioned in an earlier answer. This sheet would seep into every nook and cranny of clothing, and even worse, the cigarettes. Every cig was a Marlboro Red when you were underway. Oftentimes when pulling into port, smoking an on-boat cig for the first time was like breathing fresh air after sea trials. Sometimes the boats dive deep and then surface as quickly as possible, an emergency blow. These behemoth steel tubes the length of a football field come up so quick they rise slightly out of the surface and crash down on their belly like a breaching whale. Insane. We still celebrated holidays as much as possible while underway. We would make costumes for Halloween out of Vebred nuclear grade duct tape. We would make Christmas trees out of lock wire and washers. For all the talk of submariners being homosexual, the environment was caustically homophobic for the most part. The most limiting resource for extended deployments was not fuel, it was food. At the beginning of the deployment, all hands line up and form a human chain from topside to the engine room and pass down hundreds of #10 cans and line the entire surface of the deck plates with them. We would then cover the layer of cans with plywood, wrapped in a tarp material, and that would be our floor for the first few months. It also meant you had to get used to ducking to avoid pipes all over again. Speaking of which, being tall on a submarine did suck, but not too much more than being average height. After about a week of bumping your head, your body would subconsciously learn to duck and weave at the right time. I did have an officer concuss himself in the first week on board. In his defense, he was like 6'4" inches. It wasn't as isolated as you might think. We has sailor mail. I wrote and received thousands of emails during my tenure on board. I'm lucky to have such dedicated friends to keep up the stream of letters. While you are on watch your 6-hour shift, you have a lot of free time between taking logs. I would often write 4 or 5 typed pages a watch and get at least as many in return. I still have all of them archived and look back on them from time to time. Time is an illusion. Lunchtime, doubly so. This may sound odd, but there are only 18 hours in a day on a boat. With no sunlight, the idea of a circadian rhythm goes out the non-existent window. Most times you would be a member of a 3-section watch rotation. You would stand watch for 6 hours and then get 12 hours off. Lather, rinse, repeat, more on lathering and rinsing to come. If you were really lucky, you would have a 4th watch stander for your rotation who would always stand the 6 PM to midnight. Sometimes midnight was called balls. Hilarious. This meant if your watch fell into that slot, you would get kicked out. This was amazing when it happened. That meant you would have a total of 30 hours off between watches once every 3 rotations, and hot damn, could you binge a lot of reading/DVD/gaming in that time. Showers that took over 5 minutes from entry to exit were called Hollywood showers. While not explicitly forbidden, internal culture, peer pressure, and outright verbal abuse enforced this time limit. I slept in the torpedo racks. Sure, you may have heard of hot racking, the practice of 3 people sharing 2 beds. When you get in bed, it is still hot from his body heat. Not as bad in practice as it sounds in theory, but still not pleasant. But, have you ever heard of torpedo racking? On a boat like the Philadelphia, which had a DDS, dry dock shelter, mounted to the top, we would often bring special ops on board. The guys, as cool as they were, took up rack space. So, to compensate for the displaced bunk room, we would place plywood sheets over the torpedo racks and throw a mattress on it. I slept like this for the first 3 months on board. All submariners when reporting on board, save the officers, would have to go through a semi-hazing type initiation called cranking. Crank duty was being a galley slave. You would work in the kitchen and serve meals to everyone on board. You would do dishes and compact trash. While this sounds miserable, and it actually served well as an introduction to the crew. Since you worked a 12-hour shift, you would end up seeing every member of the crew, officer and enlisted, cycle through at some point. Filling their glasses, taking their dishes, and ingratiating yourself served well to establish your face to the people you now depended on. That's it. I'm done. I could go on for days, but I'll try to answer any follow-ups. Thanks for the trip down memory lane. I didn't serve on a sub, but I had a professor that did. I'm pretty sure he said he served on a high-O class subs. I'm not sure if this is common among sub crews, or maybe it's a Navy thing when underway, but he told us that if there was ever some kind of angry tension between two crew members, like they were pissed off at each other over something that happened, they would go fight it out in the missile room, since no one was ever in there to just get it out of the way and put it behind them. Basically, it was an unspoken understanding from leadership that if crew members were pissed at each other, they wouldn't want it to continue to build up or spread, so they would turn a blind eye to those who wanted to settle it and didn't want to see or hear about it. The two guys would go off to fight, and they'd have someone stand lookout, and they'd go settle whatever shit was going on between them. Afterwards, they'd go see their corpsman and tell them that they tripped and fell into something or something like that, and things would go back to normal. Everyone was stuck sharing the same space with the same people, and people would get stir crazy and short-tempered, and they needed some kind of outlet to let off that steam. Fighting was just an easy outlet for that. Obligatory, not a submariner, just raised by one. Disclaimer: my dad did a bit of sneaky, borderline espionage-y stuff during the Cold War, and if word got out about even half of the shit that, unofficially, went down between their navy and ours, there's no doubt in my mind we would have entered into a full-blown war with the Soviets. We are talking mysteriously sunken subs with no alibi, stolen intel, and creeping around enemy territory, where you shouldn't be. Speaking of which, dads go to story/quotas while off the coast of a certain country, spying on the bad guys, as he called them. They suddenly heard a loud boom, almost sounding and feeling like a direct hit. The entire submarine shook, and as everyone scrambled into high alert mode, his co-goes, that son of a beach just dropped a depth charge on us. Hands on hips, shaking his head almost in amused disbelief, like he was more impressed than scared. To this day, I'm pretty sure my dad is still impressed/entertained by the memory of his reaction. In short, submarine warfare is almost exactly like the game Battleship, and we've all come a hell of a lot closer to nuclear war than we realize. We had civilian clothes that would be used solely for going out to sea, because your clothes would smell like a chemical commonly referred to as amine, that is used to scrub breathing air. This smell lingers in your clothes for what seems like ages, and explaining to a girl what you do for a living and why your clothes smell funny usually doesn't lessen the bussy deterrence effect it has. The reactor going critical is a good thing. It basically means the hot rock is hot and ready like a Little Caesar pizza. Submariners survive on coffee and thermogenic workout supplement/weight loss pills. Sleep is a luxury you just don't have. Ann. Speaking of sleep, if you served on a boat, then you learned quickly that you can sleep in places and positions no sane person would ever think possible. A bilge? Sure, why not? The fan room through which all the ship's ventilation is pushed and routed through. One of the noisiest places on the boat. Absolutely. Standing up? Yeah, that's a thing. On a metal platform strapped to a torpedo? You betcha as that's a thing too. The ship requires your soul to power it. A common myth is that submarine food is much better than the rest of the Navy. The truth is it depends on how big of a miserable dickbag your cooks are and how long you have been out to sea. The good sheet runs out fast, and once it's gone, the only place to find a good snack is in the submarine prison black market. Cigarettes are more valuable than gold. Even if you don't smoke, bring a few cartons and you'll be more hood rich than Bubba Slick Dick down at the state penitentiary. On a surface ship you may never even talk to your captain in person, or in some cases, like on carriers, you may never even walk down the same ladders and ways that he uses. On a submarine you can be on a first name basis and know what his penis looks like. Since we are on the subject of penises, you probably know what all 100 something men's penises look like, and probably have had some of them rested upon your shoulder while you are trying to drive the ship. There is no mama joke, dead baby joke, racist joke, dick, fatched, sheet slash piss, sech, or any other kind of vulgar joke a submariner hasn't heard. Hell, we probably created all of them 6 hours sitting in a chair on watch, surrounded by a bunch of other hairy smelly assholes in a long metal tube with nothing better to do but bullshit each other is a recipe for vulgarity that even the internet cannot rival. And if I haven't convinced you on the idea of cuddling up to your local recruitment office yet, then I have one more polished turd to sell you. There is no experience quite like it. There are moments that make it all worth it, such as sitting up on the bridge standing the lookout watch after surfacing the ship at night and witnessing endless miles of glass smooth water, moonlight, and the Milky Way galaxy. You will make lifelong relationships and be forever inducted into one of the most tight-knit brotherhoods of dudes that will always have your back. These disgusting scumbag apes will be your brothers. You will fight, laugh, love, hate, commiserate, and work harder than you thought possible together, and at the end of the day walk away from the journey of a man ready for anything the world can offer. The rest of life and all its hurdles will seem trivial because you've seen hell on earth before and nothing else will test you more. I've known men who have said they would rather be in the desert dodging Taliban bullets than be on the boat, and these men have experienced both. They call it the hardest job in the Navy for a reason, and if you're the kind of person who wants that adverse life-changing challenge experience, then submarines are for you. Throwaway. We had about 10 chameleons drawn in the engine room. I only found a couple. They were spots that were especially tight and difficult to get into, crammed between pipes and machinery and tanks and insulation and valves, but it was difficult or impossible to see people who were there. Even with normal, non-chameleon spots, you might be standing somewhere, minding your own business, and look up to see a set of eyes and a head looking at you from deep inside some machinery. Sometimes an arm would reach out and grab you. You were never alone, and if you were, for instance late at night in port, it was creepy point you knew everyone, and could tell who anyone was from any angle, and in dim lighting point, if you showed up to the ship with deep cut marks in your arm, a lot of people would tell you that you couldn't get that right and that you deserved it. I wasn't one of those people. Once, I saw a new kid that was having a hard time with a cast around his arm. I said, "What did you do, Green? Cut yourself?" He put his head down and walked away and was gone that day. If your captain sucks, your life will suck for years. Full stop. Career sailors may have their career ruined on a whim, and there's pretty much nothing anyone can do about it. Point. When I first got to my ship, I was introduced to a person with an enormous open sore on his mouth. He told me that he got it from oral sex with a hooker. As we were walking away, I asked what the guy did. He was a cook. Luckily, he got there at the same time I did, so I was able to spend 4 years with him cooking. Point. There's a good chance that you realize you're going to die about tens of minutes before it happens. I think the Thresher sank for a couple dozen minutes before it finally collapsed, and they were all probably watching the approach to crush depth the entire time. Obligatory, not a submariner, but dad was for 20 years. So I've seen the inside of several Los Angeles class subs. There is no wasted space. Almost every bulkhead that can have a storage locker does have a storage locker. The coffee pot has a little seat belt bar to keep it from tipping during angles, and dangles all the chairs in the wardroom. Officer's mess, clip into the table, and if necessary the wardroom table can be used as an operating table, so it has a big as light over the top. Point. When fully crewed, some crewmen do have to sleep in the torpedo bay. Read somewhere on this thread that one guy had to experience hot racking. That's a thing. 2. To flush the toilet there is a valve to fill the bowl with water and a lever to open the basin of the toilet bowl. A lot noisier than I expected at first. Also, being one of the 2 females on the ship at the time, our escort had to clear the head, make sure no one was puping, before we were allowed in. Point. The captain's stateroom has a sink that folds into the wall. The desk folds down. The bed folds up and becomes a little booth for private meetings, or if the captain needs more room for charts. Where there are stairs they are hella steep. I'm sure you get used to them after a while, but that surprised me. I expected ladders everywhere. Point. Each boat has their own game. I knew one was Uckers, pretty much a sorry knockoff with homemade game board and pieces. Cribbage was on another boat. Oh, and there were standard playing cards, and then Playboy playing cards. This will probably get buried, but those are some things that always fascinated me. Never knew how dad did it all those years, but he said as with anything, you just get used to it. My father served on Los Angeles class submarines for my entire childhood. I know a bit about them, but most of what I know is experience type stuff, from spending time on them visiting my dad when he had duty, maybe once a week, when they weren't out to sea for 12 years or so. Lowering yourself down into the hatch is awkward as hell, and not something I ever adjusted to. My dad used to tell me about going swimming in the literal middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean, and there were men that would stand guard with guns to shoot any sharks that might approach. He said it was rare that they were allowed to surface for long enough to do something like this, but it helped morale and such. Let them get some sun and see something that wasn't the inside of the submarine once in a while. In 2001, the sub he was on was in 3 separate accidents. If your husband or father is on a submarine and there's an accident, you get called to a building on base and given a very basic description of what happened, and you're told if there were any members of the crew harmed or not, but not immediately who was harmed. I'm guessing if you're an immediate family member, meaning wife or underage child, of someone that was harmed in an accident, you're debriefed separately, but mine wasn't, so I can't say this for sure. In the debriefing, you're told not to speak to any reporters if they called, but the news usually knew more than we did anyway. The first accident in 2001 was the most serious. They collided with the underside of a Japanese fishing boat when they were doing an emergency surfacing maneuver. I heard it was to show off to some people on board, but I don't know if that's true or not. I think 9 Japanese citizens were killed in the incident. 4 of them were high school students learning about fishing on their spring break from school. All around, it was a horrible tragedy, and, last I checked, their submarine wasn't allowed in Japan. The next accident was when they ran aground off Saipan, and the third accident was somewhere in the Indian Ocean. That was as much detail as they'd give. They hit the side of an aircraft carrier. I think some men my father worked with had some mental health issues after all of this, because they thought the boat was cursed and they were going to die in an accident at some point. I used to spend dinner once a week on the submarine with my dad when he had duty in the captain's quarters. I think that's what it was called. There was a little built-in C-shaped bench and a table, and usually a bunch of cubby holes with kid-friendly DVDs stashed for the DVD player, and I can absolutely attest to that very specific submarine smell. I remember the whole house smelling like that for days on end. When he came back from Westpac, it took several washes for his clothes not to smell like that. I recently had a friend come back from sea, and we were traveling together, and he brought his sea bag, and it smelled just like that. It's been a little over a decade since I've smelled that submarine smell, and my friend was surprised when I told him not to worry about the smell, that I actually like the way it smells. I guess having grown up associating that smell with my father, especially with him being home for the first time in months, it makes sense that it left a positive imprint. Submarines have no windows whatsoever and rely entirely on sonar and what they can see through the periscope, but I always got the impression that sonar was more reliable. I'm not sure how any of the accidents happened, but I know multiple people were court-martialed during that year. I believe the first one was due to a failure of one of the sonar displays or something like that. It was reported to the captain, who didn't think it mattered. I'm sure others on here have way more experience and interesting things to say about submarines than I can, but I thought I'd chime in. Lots of people attempt suicide. On my ship, about 5% of all new personnel would attempt during their first year. Occasionally senior personnel would attempt. The atmosphere is awful, as it's recycled, but mentally you tune it out after a few days. But good god, it's bad. Everything smells, everything is oily and dusty. Lots of people have dermatological problems from the filthy air. I got out a decade ago, and I have a never-ending prescription for steroid cream that I have to rub all over my hands and arms twice a day. The Department of Veterans Affairs gives me a check for $100 every month to pay for it. The stories say that submarines have the best food, and maybe that was true a long time ago, but these days they serve school cafeteria food. Seriously, it's called institutional food. Google it. Even if your cooks are good, there's not much they can do with it, since it's preformed and pre-cooked. By WWII standards it's probably outstanding point these days. The US submarine force is a vicious, cruel place. They don't have a purpose. 30, 40, 50 years ago their purpose was to protect the US from the Soviet submarine force. Now they are just a well-entrenched relic of the Cold War. Today they literally swim in circles listening to their own echoes. If you pay attention, you'll see stories in the news once or twice every year about nuclear security problems at Air Force missile bases, people ignoring security protocol, sleeping on the job, misplacing nuclear things, forging laborious paperwork. Submarines have the same problems as results of the same stagnation and demoralization. One of the sonar technicians on my boat said the purpose of Westpac is to verify that Chinese submarines operate near China. We swim over to China and we freak out and report, hey, there are Chinese submarines here. Another sonoman told non-Navy friends that a submarine is a big black tube filled with hatred. They have no purpose today and everyone on board knows it. Everyone knows they are getting divorced and ruining their health and going months without seeing the sun and living empty, joyless lives for no tangible reason whatsoever. So one of the big requirements for being a long-term submariner is slipping into denial early on. You don't have anyone to fight, so you fight each other. You tell yourself that your purpose is to be tough, and it's okay to treat your workers like shit, because that will make them tough. And your 3 ex-wives divorced you, and your children won't speak to you, and you have no friends outside of the submarine force, because none of those people are tough enough. And when big problems arise it's okay to cook the books, because it will just be this one time, and maybe one more time after this, and the people who inspect the books are other submariners with the same problems as you and they'll understand. And that's a key point that has allowed these problems to persist. The submarine force is special. It has special needs, and special requirements and special methods. And so it has its own supply organizations and contractors, and its own medical corps, and its own administrative staff, and it's very insular and isolated, and there's a revolving door between operations and oversight, and problems just become culture and never get fixed. I could ramble for hours. Long story short, it's an awful place, and the happiest people I knew there were the people who got out after one tour. I was a radioman, and one of the best parts about that job is you get a secure room with an escape hatch that drops below to the kitchen. That meant the cooks and radio were pretty tight and would get extra food, which was great because you typically couldn't leave the room if it was just you. When the sub is full with extra crew, like crypto crew or others, they have beds underneath torpedoes that they open up for the newest and unqualified submariner. If they have to fix the SINS pump it gets pretty smelly down there. Also they don't turn off the lights. There are only a couple beds that are longer than 6 foot. For the most part, you share 2 beds with 2 other guys. When underway you're on 18-hour days with 3 6-hour shifts. That means you have to pack under the bed accordingly, or you won't be able to get your sheet if someone is sleeping in there. It also means sharing sheets with sometimes unsanitary people. I brought a heavy blanket and slept on top of it all. The screw is not behind protection, so you can see/feel how fast it's rotating. There are 2 dryers and 2 washers. When doing dryers you have to man it in case of a fire. There will be little to no air in the entire sub in about 2 minutes. When a fire occurs 3 officers share one stateroom. The only exception is the captain who gets his own room. When you surface and need to man a lookout in the mast, you have to manually open each hatch and get wet on your way up. Not fun if it's dark and cold outside. Beautiful during sunrise or sunset. The air smells like dry chemicals and it gets on your clothes and your skin. Takes a while to get off. The doc is the most useless person on the boat until he's needed and always gets cheat for not putting in as much work as the rest of the crew. Hung out with a lot of guys that were in a Virginia class, lived in Court, and they were in Groton. They said sub guys are the best because they really screen them all first for emotional stability and things like that. Went on a tour of the sub and it was pretty cool. They said we were in the safest place in the world to keep people from being scared. The torpedo room is where they work out because it's the only place with enough space. If someone asked a question about how far/deep/etc the sub could go they weren't allowed to answer. Apparently there is an underwater equivalent to the Mile High Club, but it's pretty tough because most partners don't get to go on the sub when it is underway. As a visitor, most guys said they'd be fine with having women on board, but logistically it'd be hard if the women needed a separate bathroom/sleeping quarters. They said there were some gay guys on the crew and no one had a problem with it. Stayed in contact for a little, while when they went underway they went to the North Pole. I think they all drink beer while they are there, and through the Panama Canal. Commander said that is pretty nerve-wracking, on their way to Pearl Harbor. I'm late to the party, so this will probably be buried. I served in a Sea Wolf class back in the 2000s. A few points of dissension I'd like to make with regards to others' comments. The food isn't good anymore. Navy logistics ruined that one. The camaraderie is so-so, and depends on what command you are at. Some commands are horrible, others are great. It really depends on what your ship does and where. I'd also like to point out that the whole claustrophobia thing really isn't that big of a deal. The ship isn't set up all that differently from a cruiser when it comes to that sort of thing, and no one is heard talking about claustrophobia on cruisers. That said, one thing I think I'd add to the mix that hasn't been said is the lights. We used fluorescent lights that would slowly dim as they went bad. Then one day, usually on someone else's shift, the electricians division would take it upon themselves to change all the light bulbs at once. It was like someone turned the lights up to 11. One time they put in some wonky bulbs in one of the side walkways, and it gave the effect of being in the bad part of town. Anyways, sorry I missed the fun. I hope you all take this as a lesson to never sign up for submarines. Our internet email system is literally Hotmail's UI. Some enterprising sonar tech years ago borrowed it and wrote Sailor Mail. You write your message, it goes to comms, they run it through a filter to check for confidential information, then when available it relays to shore, where they check for the same, and then it goes to the internet. Reverse the situation coming back. Best case you have 24-hour delay. There are nukes, and there are corners. Nukes work in the engine room, which takes up the aft 1/3 of the boat. They, objectively, have the highest ASVAB scores out of the crew, but are also notoriously socially awkward. Their work schedules in port suck way more than everyone else, because their maintenance is scrutinized to an insane degree. Actual critique: I was a witness, not participant. 2. This procedure says to have a 2-gallon bucket to hold the effluent, and time the flow rate. You appear to have acquired a 20 ounces Snapple bottle. Well, I ratioed it to correct for that, and yet, here we are. Corners work in the forward 2/3 of the boat, so named because the front of the boat is cone-ish. Close enough. Literally everyone enlisted is a corner, although we usually grant a gang auxiliary mechanics. They run the diesel, ventilation, sheet tanks, and basically everything else mechanical that isn't nuclear. Honorary not quite Kona status, because they control a lot of sheet we would like to have working. Similarly, corners learn quickly not to piss off EDIV, nuclear electricians, because they control basically everything, including your ACK light, and the hot water heaters. I have absolutely seen both of those items mysteriously danger tagged out until the owner stopped being sheety to EDIV. Culinary specialists, ACK cooks, are a special breed of their own. On my boat, we had one smart cook. The rest were varying levels of idiot. A short list of things done by cooks: used salt in place of sugar to bake cookies. Decided to brew coffee, bun coffee maker, very fast flow rate, immediately prior to angles and dangles. See other comments. I was in cruise mess for this, and watched the entire show with great interest. Gravity will in fact make the hot coffee continue to fall down plumb, and it will bypass the coffee pot once you pass 10 degrees or so. Something faked up with tomatoes and shrimp scampi. I don't remember the details, only the co-storming out of the wardroom screaming that they were never to make this dish again. Put whole pecans into the soft serve machine, trying to make butter pecan ice cream. Nice effort, but kills the machine, which EDIV has to fix. Put entire faking loaves of bread into the garbage disposal. This kills the garbage disposal, which EDIV has to fix. I probably have more that I could think of, as I'm sure others could. Finally, I have yet to witness anything as majestic and beautiful as being in the conning tower at night on a clear night. We were somewhere warm, The stars and moon were bright as hell, and everything was silent except for the wash coming over the bow. Breathtakingly beautiful. My little brother is a Nook guy on a Sea Wolf class sub. His best memory was coming up through the ice at the North Pole. Only a dozen guys got to get out, and he was one of them. Worst memory was being blackout drunk, abandoned by his fellow submariners, lying on the dock trying to remember where to go, crying about the burrito he was eating. He said that when someone just shuts down mentally, it's called going sad, or at least it was, when he was underway. A guy went sad and hung himself, and they had to wait until they could get some place to have the body removed. He really picked up a chewing tobacco habit. Unfortunately, they were doing secret stuff, and if you get him drunk enough, he'll just tell you about it. It's not interesting to me at all, but my husband likes military history and whatnot, so he enjoys it. Even though he's a Nook guy, they had pretty much everyone rotate through all the different jobs/duties, and his hands down favorite was working in the kitchen. He literally got this plaque/award for being the best at cleaning dishes. When he finally got on the Nook schedule, he discovered the joys of working on top of huge cans because of limited storage. He also told me that despite guidelines for the pH levels around the reactor, the new guys freak out when they're a little off, but once you've been at it a while, you just shrug it off and say good enough. This was all from my little brother's recollections. I can't vouch 100% because he is kind of a dum-dum. Served in a Los Angeles class for a few years. We sleep in what is referred to as a rack. It's basically a coffin with a curtain on one side. It's about 6.5 foot x 2.5 foot x 2.5 feet. Not exact measurements, but I'm guessing by my own dimensions and how snugly I fit. All your belongings are stuffed in a small compartment underneath your mattress or somewhere in the nooks and crannies of your coffin. Cloths, books, electronics, snacks, etc. It's not unheard of for some people to invest in a pocket buses or flashlights. Usually berthing was ridiculously dark, so there wasn't much to see, but you would definitely hear things coming from certain bunks. And there aren't enough racks on board, so if you were new or low ranked, you were most likely hot racking. Hot racking is when two racks are shared between three guys. It's set up so that one of the three is always on watch, so theoretically only two will ever be using it. Simulating submarine life at home. Right up from an unknown source, this floated around the internet while I was active duty. I did add some content, but most is carryover. Lock all friends and family outside. Your only means of communication should be with letters that your neighbors have held for at least 3 weeks. Discarding 2 out of 5 points. Surround yourself with 100 people, making sure at least 85 of them are people that you don't really know or like. If any unexpected guest come over, tell them they can't enter unless they are on the access list. Spend the rest of the time looking for said access list until they leave. Repeat for every unexpected guest. Disable all internet Wi-Fi including all radios and TVs to completely cut yourself off from the outside world. Have a neighbor bring you an old copy, at least 6 months old, of Time, the Inquirer Navy Times, to keep you confused about current events. Navy instructions. Monitor all home appliances hourly, recording all vital information, i.e., plugged in, lights come on when doors open, etc. Do not flush the toilet for 5 days to simulate the smell of 40 people using the same commode. Lock the restroom twice a day for a 4-hour period. Hang a sign that says secured. Blowing sanitaries. Have a large cold pot of chili standing by if anyone uses the restroom during this time, and load the pot of chili on them. Make sure they clean everything up afterwards. Keep the secured sign up for that time plus an additional 2 hours. Have week-old fruit and vegetables delivered to your garage. Wait 2 weeks before eating them. Periodically shut off all power at the main circuit breaker and run around shouting fire, 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 then restore power. Every so often, yell emergency deep or torpedo in the water. Run into the kitchen, throwing all pots/pans/dishes off the counter onto the floor. Delay mealtime at least 1 hour with a cup of coffee in your hand. Yell at your wife for not being stowed for C. Make the kids learn the location, operation, power source of every light switch, outlet, appliance, water valve, electric component. Do not let them listen to music, watch TV or have any source of enjoyment until they have memorized them all. Remove all plants, pictures, decorations. Paint everything grey or seafoam green. Yes, it's a color. Make sure the shades of grey are just slightly different. Buy 50 cases of toilet paper. Lock up all but 2 rolls. Ensure one of these 2 rolls is wet all the time. Get some broken exercise equipment mounted in your attic as close to the ceiling as possible. Strap it down so it's unable to be used every 10 weeks. Simulate a visit to another port. Go directly to the city slums wearing your best clothes. Find the worst looking place and ask for the most expensive beer that they carry. Drink as many as you can in 4 hours. Take a cab home taking the longest possible route. Tip the cabbie after he charges you double because you're a tourist. Make sure to take someone with you that you will end up having to carry back on board. Use fresh milk for only 2 days after each port visit. Keep the bedroom thermostat at 36°F. Use only a thin blanket for warmth. Ensure that the water heater is connected to a device that provides water at a flow rate that varies from a fast drip to a weak trickle, with the temperature alternating rapidly from 35 to 200°F. Stand outside at attention at dawn. Have the poorest reader you know read the morning paper out loud. Be sure to have him skip over anything pertinent. Bonus points for doing this before sunrise. Extra points if it's raining. Also, you can conduct the previous evolution, but with everyone packed in the attic. Bonus points if you do it during one of the coldest or hottest days. Every 4 hours, check the fluid level in your car's radiator. Check tire pressure to replace air lost from excessive pressure checks. Be sure to place a red tag on ignition stating danger. Do not operate while you perform these checks. Inform your neighbor as to the results of these checks. Have him tell you to repeat the checks because he did not see you perform them. If the red tag happens to fall off, conduct an investigation on why the tag fell. Make sure this investigation lasts at least 8 hours. Meanwhile, nobody sleeps or eat. Perform a weekly disassembly and inspection of your lawnmower on Saturdays. Sundays. Declare to your entire family that they use too much water during the week, so all showering is secured. At 5 AM have someone blow a whistle and shout Reveille, Reveille, up all bunks now Reveille. Submit a leave request form to your father-in-law. Have him tell you not to submit it because it will be denied anyways in the middle of January. Place a podium at the end of your driveway. Have you family stand watches at the podium, rotating at 4-hour intervals. Sit in your car, let it run for 4 hours before going anywhere. This is to ensure your engine is properly lit off. Making sure to log all gauge readings every 30 minutes. Walk around your car for 4 hours checking the tire pressure every 15 minutes. Make your family qualify to operate all the appliances in your home, that is dishwasher operator, blender technician, toaster operator, etc. When taking showers, make sure you turn off the water while soaping. After 2 minutes, have someone banging on your door telling you to hurry up. Lock yourself and your family in your house for 6 weeks. Then tell them that at the end of the 6th week you're going to take them to Disneyland for weekend liberty. When the end of the 6th week rolls around, inform them that Disneyland has been cancelled due to the fact that they need to get ready for Oz and that it will be another week before they can leave the house. Make sure to spend that week cleaning, conducting drills. When your children have been in bed for 3 hours, run into their room with a megaphone and shout at the top of your lungs that your home is under attack and have them man their battle stations. Remind them to battle dress. Wake up every night and have a PBJ sandwich on stale bread. Optional, canned ravioli or cold soup. Announce with megaphone. Commence snorkeling. Start a lawnmower in your living room. Keep it running for 8 hours, making sure to take logs. Prior to turning off the lawnmower, announce with a megaphone secure snorkeling. Continue to take logs of equipment being secured 4 hours. After you go to sleep, have your wife whip open the curtain, shine a flashlight in your eyes, mumble, "Sorry, wrong rack," or sign this. Bonus points if she catches you taking care of business. Post a menu on the refrigerator door informing all that you are having steak for dinner. Then make them wait in line for at least 1 hour. When they finally get to the kitchen, tell them that you are out of steak, but you have hot dogs. Repeat daily until they don't pay attention to the menu anymore and just ask for hot dogs. Put on headphones. Don't plug them in. Go stand in front of your stove. Say, to no one in particular, "Stove manned and ready." Stand there for 3 to 4 hours. Say, again to nobody, "Stove secured." roll up the headphone cord, and put it away. Throw an empty box Oscar into the swimming pool, shout man overboard, run into the kitchen, sweep all the pots/pans/dishes off the counter onto the floor, then yell at your wife for not having the place stowed for C. Put on a clean white suit, then go change the oil in your car. Make sure you post a red tag prior to stopping the simulation. Let everyone go home, but keep yourself conducting the simulation for another day to simulate having duty. Didn't serve on a submarine, but my dad served on a Trident nuclear submarine, not the fast attack one he was hoping he'd get, and therefore put as his third selection. However, in the academy he scored high enough that they actually gave him his first choice. It's boring and you get 6 hours to sleep. If you're reading something, someone will come and ask you what you're reading, then what it's about. Then if it's good, then they'll ask if they can borrow it when you're done. And this will happen over and over again, each time with a different crew member. My father served during the Gulf War, but the closest he came to action was when they mistook rain for a possible enemy point. If you want to never see action, go on a big as nuclear submarine, because their goal is to exist somewhere in the oceans and have nukes. I can maybe answer some questions about what it was like indirectly by asking my father, or by telling you what he told me in the past. I served on the last diesel sub in the US Navy that saw action in WWII, helped decommission it in 1975, so my experience, a bit over 4 years, was old school as compared to the guys replying that served on nuke boats that are, really, far more habitable. In fairness to them, I have to say that, while for many years into the nuclear era the longest patrol record was still held by a diesel boat crew whose replacement was sunk, while on their way to relieve that crew, the guys on nuclear powered boats routinely go out and down for months at a time, a challenge in and of itself. That said, there are many things I could discuss that are different from normal life, but I'll limit it to a couple. Point: the physical environment. I don't know why, but all boats smell the same. It's not really offensive, just an odor you always remember. On the diesels, aka pig boats, the ability to make fresh water was quite limited, so, except for those involved with food preparation, bathing was quite limited. I'm told that during war time the crew was limited to a 2-minute shower about every 3 weeks. You just got used to never bathing. I got used to never changing my clothes for 2-3 weeks at a time. See item #1. While nuke boats have air scrubbers and oxygen generators to renew the air, on a pig boat, you breathed the air you took down with you, and in the 70s virtually everyone smoked, so you may as well have, even if you didn't when using the snorkel to draw in fresh air while still submerged, just under the surface. The diesel engines had priority. If we went a bit too deep and the snorkel closed to avoid sucking water into the boat, a very big no-no, the engines would draw a vacuum in the boat which changed to a quick increase in pressure when the snorkel cleared the surface. As a consequence, many ex-submariners have hearing problems now. Onto the psychological environment. At the time I volunteered, early 70s, the submarine force was all volunteer. We had to pass a psychological and some physical screening to be accepted. This was discontinued a bit later as the Navy was trying to get enough crew for the nuclear fleet, leading to some interesting situations for a while. So we all had at least that going for us regarding those around us. However, you're not accepted as a submariner until you qualified, which involved learning and demonstrating practical working knowledge of every system, air, water, fuel, electrical, ventilation, etc. on board the boat you were on, and were signed off by multiple layers of crew and officers on each system and compartment. This had 2 practical effects. #1 In an emergency, never far away on any boat, any crew member could function in any capacity to help deal with the emergency, and #2 you knew that was the case with every qualified crew member. This meant that, while it wasn't outwardly expressed, there was, and still is, a certain level of mutual respect. You might think that a guy was a total asshole, but you knew that in a pinch he'd save your ass, along with his, if he could point. Because of this level of respect, the rubbing and superficial harassment was sometimes merciless, or at least it would appear so to an outsider that may or may not explain it to an outsider, but a real result of this is a camaraderie that lasts a lifetime. We all consider each other brothers from different mothers. DBF. Diesel boats forever. Ex-Royal Navy submariner here. Served on Trafalgar class boats. Most of us served 6-hour shifts, a watch, 6 on, 6 off and so on. No days off. That's it for the whole trip, which can be months long. You may get a week alongside, in which case you get out in a 5-star hotel. All your eating, sleeping, watching films is done during your 6 hours off. Point: there are not enough beds for everyone. The less senior guy's hot bunk. When one is on watch, the other is in their rack. There are spare racks on the torpedo racks for guests. Small cuts take a long time to heal. Really annoying. Point: the O2 levels alters, so you can be really awake and alert, or groggy and sleepy. Point: you can only shower once every 2 days, and that involves water for a few seconds. Turn the water off, soap and wash, then rinse off. The machines that produces fresh water are noisy, so their use is kept to a minimum. Point: they do bloody emergency drills all the bloody time. Normally in my bloody off watch, when I'm trying to get some kip, there is a big rival between submariners and skimmers, those who serve in ships. Submariners have to have a lot more knowledge than skimmers. Every submariner has to know all the systems on the boat, where every major valve and pipe work is, and what it does. Submariners get extra pay and in port, get put up in 5-star hotels with breakfast included and given cash to piss up. Sorry, I mean to buy lunch and dinner. Skimmers have to eat and sleep on their ship and report in daily. Point: edit. Forgot to add that when we dive deep, the submarine gets crushed. Metal ladders shrink, floor tiles can pop up, cupboard doors jam shut. Freaky when you first experience it. My old housemaster served as a commander on a Resolution class submarine in the Royal Navy during the 1980s until mid-90s, when he went to university to become a DT teacher at our school. He gave several fascinating seminars about his time in the Navy and what it was like serving on nuclear subs during the Cold War. A few things I remember from his talks: the food was always better at the start. You could tell how long you had been at sea by how bad the food was getting, especially when you started eating the reserve tins of food at the back of the store. Likewise the drink. They had some beers on board that they were allowed to have every few nights as a treat. You knew you had been at sea longer than intended when the beers ran out and you started on the gin. Point: most of his time was spent patrolling and tracking Russian subs. They had a sort of unwritten rule with the Russian subs that they would take it in turns to track each other at a distance using passive sonar. If either side pushed their luck and tried to track too closely, they would ping the other sub very loudly. Apparently it really echoed very loudly in the subs. Everyone would hear it. They would then swap positions and the other sub would go off for a bit with the pinged sub tracking them. If either sub surfaced, the other sub would come up for air as well. They would sit at sea or up at the Arctic ice sheet and just watch each other for a bit getting some air, then dive again. Pretty much a big game of grandmother's footsteps under the sea. With nuclear subs and warheads they had unlimited fresh, hot water due to the nuclear reactor. Many hot showers and cups of tea were had. Point: they were hugely cut off from the outside world once deployed. They got family messages once a week and any updates, but they couldn't respond to them. Sometimes their deployment lasted longer than the usual rotation for whatever reason, and rather than being out for 3 months, it could be much longer. He missed the birth of 2 of his daughters due to this, and got the news somewhere under the North Atlantic. You got seriously good at Scrabble. Point: the Royal Navy gave him no compensation or additional care when he developed, at first, testicular cancer, and later a terminal brain tumor, after he slept next to armed nuclear warheads for the best part of 15 years. Just a bad coincidence, apparently. Point: he was a lovely funny man who I still think of on occasion. He gave great life advice, and is sorely missed by many. Served 5 years on a relay class. You realize that oxygen can straight up get you high. They keep the O2 levels fairly low on the boat while underway, so if a fire breaks out, it doesn't spread like crazy. Our captain would crank up the oxygen levels during field day, literally just a day, where you clean like crazy, but you get hamburgers as a reward afterwards. It was more effective than caffeine. Same experience when you come back from deployment/patrol. Wouldn't be able to sleep for days after coming back. Driving was super weird after coming back. I typically didn't wear glasses, but always needed them. Before I hadn't focused on anything further than 5 feet from my face. Pretty sure it's why I'm the only one in my family that wears glasses now. Hate days were a thing, probably caused by not seeing the sun for so long. Fight/wrestling matches would break out all the time. The entire experience was similar to high school. Everything was clique-wide between the nukes and the corners. People who worked on the reactor versus people who worked on everything else up front. Still friends with a lot of people who were on my boat. You are going to see someone's dick. Not like yo man your fly is undone or what are you doing changing in the common area seeing someone's dick. No. It's a long game wherein certain random fucking sailors set up elaborate pranks for you to experience their ballsacks and dick properly in full form. Random penis on the shoulder by a high rank just to troll. A random fucking sonar tech after a briefing asked us if we wanted to see an Australian road map right before he pulled out a flashlight and shined through his stretched out ballsack to show the blood vessels like road maps. Get it? Because it's his down under rather than dicing around. The lack of space is extremely noticeable. Public toilets and airplane bathrooms won't even faze you. The man who sheets in Davy Jones's locker can sheet anywhere, anytime. Oh, and if you ever want to see what zombie societies would look like, visit a chow hall after battle stations and drilling sheet sliding around the table and people grabbing it instinctively. It's like a scene from a comedy movie. Fresh air is better than cocaine. Ever seen a group of people emerge from a can and act like maniacs? Yep. Oh. Finally, sonar techs are fucking weird. Faking fact 95% are super faking weird. This isn't a stereotype. It's a 100% chance of success that this guy wearing the street rating is a faking weirdo with great hearing. I'm a bit late to the party, but fuck it. I could literally talk about this sheet for hours because I just got off a first flight 688 a year ago and started college in Europe. Haunts me to this day. Fun fact #1742. Submarines are human petri dishes. On the way back to Hawaii one time, a guy brought a stomach flu with him from eating bad bussy or something, and one by one nearly all 140 plus people got sick. Keep in mind that there aren't many toilets on the boat and some toilets are only allowed to be used by certain people. So guys were sheeting and vomiting in buckets waiting for their turn to go. I had a rack opposite to the middle level head and I could hear people moaning and blowing chunks until I fell asleep. There was so much vomiting that the air started to actually smell slightly acidic. I thought I was going to make it home without getting sick because I was wearing gloves around and sanitizing everything. Wrong. There I'm driving the boat at like 3 AM and all of a sudden it dawns on me that I'm going to sheet myself if I don't leave right now. It hit me like a faking truck. So I get relieved and join the rest of the zombie crew. I have no idea how we didn't have a collision or some other fatal error on that trip because everyone was so weak and tired from the flu. Late to the party, but here we go. Served on a Los Angeles fast attack sub for a while, and while most of the stuff has probably been said, we'll leave this one point: the lowered oxygen levels are interesting. When on mission, you sometimes can't, or just push back ventilating the compartments to bring on fresh air. This not only results in the atmosphere monitoring machines alarming for a few hours when you walk by, but obviously makes you sluggish. I remember flies getting on board during a food resupply, and then over the course of a few days due to oxygen levels they got slower and slower until you could just kind of reach out and poke them. Also, due to lower oxygen, lack of sunlight, and oil in the air constantly in the engine room, where I was as a nuke mechanic, you just don't heal much. Cuts I got would take weeks to go from scab to scar. Also, coffee was always covered in an oil film, and the percolator containers were pretty much always being rotated and never cleaned. It's just odd how you get used to it, but then again you have 2 18-hour work days with 3 6-hour shifts, so your shift rotated through the day: morning watch, afternoon watch, evening watch, mid watch. We turned the red lights on at sundown. Navdev kept track of things like that, which helped with the day/night thing, but the red lights weren't everywhere, and it was still a little surreal looking at a 12-hour clock and not knowing if it was 1 AM or PM in the moment at times. The background noise and constant hum of machinery could lull you to sleep or drive you crazy. Waking up in the coffin was about the worst thing ever. Where the rack you sleep in is pretty small, it might not even be possible for bigger dudes to roll over, and enclosed on all sides, except one which has a curtain on it, where you got in and out, and you wake up in the pitch black. Forget where you are, deep underwater in a sub, trying to get out of the back of your rack, and feel all around not finding the one side that's open. Lots of panic and terror ensues. Being around all the engineering and equipment, and how it all works together still blows my mind. It's pretty neat. There's nothing like pulling into port after deployment, and being put on liberty. Served on Trafalgar Class, UK. If you're surplus to the boat's regular crew, i.e. trainees or training staff, you sleep in the weapon stowage compartment on beds, which are specially made to go on the weapon rails. I spent 10 weeks sleeping inches away from a Tomahawk land attack missile, TLAM, which are cold as hell when your bearers brushes against it in the middle of the night. When you go away on a patrol you can't take aerosols on board, so everyone has to use roll-on deodorant. It's recommended that you take multivitamins to make up for the lack of sunlight. It's also recommended you take laxatives and Imodium, remedy for diarrhea, when going on a patrol. The first few days once you've dived can be a bit of a weird time for your body. The pressure, atmosphere and other environmental factors affect your BMs. I didn't have a proper stool for a few days. A colleague of mine went 27 days without one. He was pretty sick. They considered a medevac to get him off, before he finally managed one. Captain monitors the air daily. Can mess with levels. To make dudes sleep better, angles. And angles is a 40-degree dive where everything slants, sub-hull shrinks. If you hang a string from wall to wall on the surface then drive to 900, the string will sag a lot. Pizza is actually really good on a sub, because they make the dough fresh. Shifts are 6 hours long, so you never know what day it is. You work 6, chill 6, sleep 6, so it's only an 18-hour day. The only way you know what it is based on what meal they're serving at that time point. If you run a boomer class submarine you're gonna do nuclear launch drills daily. This means that an encrypted message is sent to 4 people on the boat with launch info. They each decrypt the message individually, then meet and compare results. If one person fails the decryption, the launch is impossible. The only person who can hold both launch keys at the same time is the captain, so to lower levels bring the captain the launch keys with both their hands on the same lanyard. Imagine 2 people holding the same stick. If you're in deep silence you can't flush toilets or make any noise. Everyone goes to bunk and chills. This is for enemy sonar. 72 days is the longest stretch I've heard of without surfacing. 900 feet is how deep civilians are aware a military submarine can go. The classified information on that I'm sure says they go deeper. Source, not a sub guy, but lived with a 30-year captain for a while. We drank scotch, and I asked him questions about subs almost endlessly. Fascinating sheet. I got to do a Tiger cruise with my dad, who is a 30 sub vet on his last at sea. It was a 3-day deal, nothing crazy. It was on the US Georgia, after it was converted to the SSGN. The absolute craziest thing to me is that during the dive sailors went all around the boat with a clipboard and physically checked for leaks. Like actually looking for water coming into a vessel meant to sink. I don't know why that seems crazy to me, just does. It is comparable to riding in an airplane. Your ears pop from pressure changes, and it moves similarly to an airplane, just the exact opposite of flying. They tied a piece of fishing line to both port and starboard sides of the boat before diving, and once we reached the Tiger approved depth the string line was dropping. The boats are put under a crazy amount of pressure from the water. Everything is soundproofed and like locked into place. The bookshelves have a bar on them, so the books don't come flying loose during dives and maneuvers. I was told the food on boomers, nuclear missile subs, is the best in the Navy. The Ohio class subs aren't as cramped and tiny as you might think. They are small but spacious at the same time. Angles and angles are really cool and fun. The torpedoes are shot with compressed air from the boat, so your ears pop when they fire them. The air is made by breaking down seawater, H2O, to hydrogen and oxygen. The submarines have a funny smell because of this. When we were kids we always said dad had submarine smell. That is because of the clean air they breathe. Cleaner than anywhere else on Earth. My father served on a sub here in Sweden as a signal/telegraphist dude, whatever it's called, and he has a ton of stories. For example, the captain forced him to proofread and correct papers on his apparently very messy divorce, since he knew my father was bound by secrecy laws. The captain was also a bit fervent and tried to ram a Russian submarine when they couldn't get a good shot, since he wanted the honor of being the first guy to catch a sub in our waters. Didn't work out sadly. But a fact not many people know, I guess that would be the fact that, at least at the time, submarines had the biggest per person budget when it came to food. I guess serving in a claustrophobic underwater metal tube for weeks and even months on end must come with some benefits. They ate lobster, reindeer, and wild game regularly. Every dinner was luxurious, one of the few luxuries they had down there. Their chef was originally a mailman, but he got really skilled at cooking after a while, and my dad still misses his food sometimes. I caught pneumonia. So bad I was in and out of consciousness and I hallucinated. I had 3 hives in me at the same time, one in each hand, top of hand, and one in my leg. I remember one lucid moment I saw Doc's face. Whitest I have ever seen someone. No hospital. He was a corpseman, not a doctor. He was a registered nurse though, and did that in his spare time on his own. He did his best with what he had. I took every pill on board. He said I almost died, twice. Took me a full 13 months to recover. I was down for a week, but back on watch soon after, you know, running a nuke reactor show from the electrician chair in maneuvering. Bed rest after watch, and extra rest leading up to ORS. It was an ORS run, and they didn't want to lose me for horse. Good times. Anyway, so point is here, there is one corpseman on board for a full crew. He basically has a limited supply of meds, and a very small sick bay, more like a sick pup tent. Someone goes down, gets hurt or what have you, do what you can. On a Trident submarine, can't just pull in port and pairs trans someone. Have to stay quiet and poke holes in the water. Us Alaska 92-96. Maybe 95. Not remember now. Don't have DD-214 handy. Buddy on another sub, a chief died. They couldn't pull in, so they put him in the freezer. That's standard protocol for deaths. Freezer until pull into port point. There are some special moments on sub, like when you surface, make it a point to pop up into sail towards sunset, watch dolphins swim in wake, breathe in some fresh air. I miss the camaraderie the most. And at the time I didn't appreciate the science behind it all until much later. If it gives you warm fuzzies, there are 18, 19, 20-year-olds out there right now in charge of nuclear reactors and nuclear missiles. No worries, we taught them how to start up a reactor while massively hungover and or still drunk from the night before shore leave. Hawaii, San Diego and Alaska shore leave can be really good. Good times, and no, we never had to shoot walrus. Submarines are dangerous as hell. Everywhere you look on a submarine, there is an item that could sink the whole boat. Torpedoes can explode. Fumes from banks of batteries can ignite. Penetrations through the hull, that is, the propeller shaft, the periscope, there are tons of others, can have stress cracks and cause flooding. Every square inch of the hull is a spot that could be weak and fail. Miles of pipe carry fluids through the submarine and could fail. Hatches can be left unsecured. Every single human on board is fallible and is a security risk. The sewage and waste disposal systems can break and cause flooding. Point the firearms on board could discharge and immediately disable essential systems. Oxygen systems could catch fire. Electrical systems can overheat and generate smoke and overwhelm a crew. They can also catch fire. Point outside are even more hazards. Other boats could puncture the hull. Enemy vessels might want to kill the submarine. There are friendly vessels that might kill you by accident. There are undersea mounts and sandbars that are crash hazards. If a submarine cannot surface after a calamity, rescue is probably impossible. Communications systems have to be above water to work. Point as dangerous as subs are, it is a faking miracle that it's been 50 years since America lost one. The last was the USS Scorpion in 1968. The Navy thought it could cut corners on repair and maintenance of all these dangerous systems and chose Scorpion for an experimental, cost-saving program of reduced maintenance that was called SubSafe. A classic example of military intelligence. The Navy thought reduced maintenance would be no problem. Didn't trust the egg-headed engineers with slide rules and poor social skills who ran calculations to estimate the risk of various dangers. When the Navy lost the Scorpion, it also lost my father. After Scorpion sank, the Navy immediately terminated SubSafe, and nobody has ever dared to suggest anything like it since. Edit. My understanding of SubSafe was backwards. Apologies. SubSafe is a program that emphasizes thoroughness and safety in submarine maintenance and repair. Scorpion was sent to sea without satisfying SubSafe requirements. Submarines are called ship by those inside. Submarines travels blind. We can't use sonar, it will tell, or position to the enemy. Usually a sub will travel at 68 km/h. Combat wise we only use 3040% of the maximum power on the motor, 1518 km/h. Top speed being 40 km/h. Going at full power depletes the battery way faster, so only use it to escape in emergencies or has a last resort. 100% electrical motors. There is not always a bed for everyone. We take turns sleeping when there is more people than beds. It is placed above the batteries. The beds, social living space, dinner and living room, is the same space of the torpedoes. Fire and smoke are really dangerous, so there is oxygen points to plug masks for everyone, all spread in the ship on every one battle stations. To control the speed we use electrical switches to rearrange the final connections of the batteries, the way we connect them, all in a line, all in parallel, half and half, and so on. This will provide less tension or more tension on the electrical motors, and so, more or less speed. Usually 5 configurations to go forward and 3 to go backwards, which one faster than the last one. This isn't about subs exactly, but interesting. I grew up in Annapolis, home of the Naval Academy. We sponsored midshipmen my whole life. Long story short, for those who don't know, midshipmen can't leave campus for the first semester. They slowly get more liberties as they go through school. The first not Naval Academy place they can go is the house of a sponsor, a local who takes them in and lets them just hang out, do laundry, eat a home cooked meal, whatever, for a Saturday afternoon. Second semester of plebe year, freshmen are called plebs. They can go out for a while Saturday afternoon. Anyway, we sponsored basketball players a lot. One of our minds was on David Robinson's team. When David Robinson entered the academy, he was normal sized for a kid his age. Maybe a little talk, but not as tall as he was when he left the academy. He grew to the size he is now between his freshman and junior years. David Robinson was apparently interested in, or assigned to, a submarine for his summer tour before he grew. But he got so tall that he wasn't able to actually work in a sub for his tour by the time it came around. Edit. Naval Academy, not Basil Academy. I was also told that one of the reasons, besides great PR, that the Academy/Navy didn't require him to fulfill his full service in the Navy, like nearly everyone else, that isn't a superstar drafted in the extremely early rounds early to a major sport, was that the Navy would have had a hard time putting him on a boat. Disposing of eggs that have gone rotten at sea. My first co was big on having fresh eggs and lettuce on patrol. Eggs were stored in a forward fan room during patrol, where they would stay unspoiled for about a month. At that point, they would start to rot. They would turn black and the smell was horrible. Disposal was done by junior enlisted guys who worked in the mess, known as mess cranks. There was a trash disposal unit, TDU, in the lower part of the ship, like a small torpedo tube, that all trash was ejected through. 2 guys would do the work, first making a cylindrical liner like a can, filling it with garbage, then topping off with iron weights, so they would sink. You'd have to get all the air out, so all eggs would have to be broken, releasing their fetid aroma into the inside of the boat. The smell was overpowering, so the 2 mess cranks would get covered in rotten egg, and they typically wore air masks, EBs, during the job. It was a powerful incentive to get qualified and move on to better jobs. The second half of patrol, we would eat canned 3-bean salad and have reconstituted eggs. Funny how people will eat reconstituted eggs at cheap hotel breakfasts. I never served, but a guy I know did. This is kind of an interesting second-hand anecdote about his experience on board a sub. After high school, a dude I know enlisted in the Navy. The guy is literally a psychopath. Like, the violent kind. He once hit my brother with a baseball bat and then threw it at my grandmother. To this day I can't believe they let him enlist, and he lasted as long as he did. Anyway, I ran into his mom one day about 2 years after he had joined up. We live in a small town. I asked how he was doing out of sheer morbid curiosity. She said he was awaiting a court-martial, which surprised literally no one, not even her it seemed. Apparently he had been stationed on a sub somewhere, and during his deployment he had gotten into some sort of altercation with his commanding officer. She said all she knew was that he had gotten into the fight, forced the officer into a room, closed the door, and somehow broke the handle, so he couldn't get out. I don't know how much of this is accurate, but it's what she said she had been told. Last I heard, he avoided any jail time, but received a dishonorable discharge. I still see him walking around town from time to time. I'm pretty sure he's still living with his mom. TLDR. The Navy apparently has pretty chill psychological requirements for letting people onto a submarine. SSBN sailor here. There's a procedure for nearly everything, like using the laundry machine and dryer when you're in the engine room, and there's a pressure differential between compartments due to an air charge or other evolution. The watertight door can be a major pain in the ass to open, or can be a projectile. Thankfully there's a damper on the door, but can otherwise swing open and cause everyone in the compartment's ears to pop. It's common to get stitches or knock your head on something regardless how tall/short you are. My head found a large portion of EEB manifolds on the boat. During fire drills, you wear these airtight masks, EEBs, with a hose that you need to run from station to station to plug into a pressurized manifold. When not plugged in, you cannot inhale, otherwise you pressure check your mask. Other people can plug into your device if you're connected to an air supply. Unintentionally buddy faking the EEB daisy chain during fire drills gets you yelled at pretty quickly. You cut off air to everyone else downstream of you. Picking on the nubs, non-useful body, or unqualified person, making them find you batteries to the sound-powered phones, feeding the shaft seals, or finding the serial numbers to the water slugs are all jokes to mess with the new guys who don't know any better. Those things don't exist. Reading through the comments, I think working on a cruise ship kind of compares to being on a submarine. Of course you are not gone for months at a time and the ceilings are not that low. Besides these differences, you can go for a long time without seeing daylight. You live in miniature cabins below sea level, and if your job doesn't involve working with passengers, you don't go up at all. There is a small deck for the crew, but you barely have time to go there. The cruise ship industry likes to work you to death. Of course there are ports every few days, but often you have no time to go out. You have to work. Since they are not regulated, kind of, by US laws, you work for 10 to 12 hours a day, often more, depending on your position. And when you have a day off, that means you have 2 hours off that day. You still work the rest. Crew members usually work around 9 months, maximum allowed by maritime law, and after a while you are so tired that you prefer to sleep every free minute. This leads to comical situations sometimes. We had uniforms for daytime and evening, even different uniforms for formal night. You are usually so confused by not having a normal routine or even daylight to orient yourself that often you'd think it's morning when in actuality it's dinner time. It is so usual. After a few times it happened to me, I started to use the 24-hour time. No confusion there. Boomer sailor, ballistic missile boats. For 20 years for different boats, so many sea stories. Which can I tell without incriminating myself for crimes without statute of limitations? Okay, everyone's heard about the great food on boats, and it's true, for the most part. There is a reason for this. A good cook will get crap from the crew, but a bad cook will find his poor choices in cuisine in his bunk. Some call this abuse, but a fleet sailor knows it's just friendly motivation. Over time you start noticing things about the food. For example, the inspection of the food stuff you load on board are inspected by vets. Not veterans as part of a job program, but veterinarians. Animal doctors during the refit period before my last run on the Georgia, SSBN 729. The cooks produced a chili night for the duty section. I was late, so the only thing left was the thermonuclear chili, guaranteed to burn 35x worse on the way out than it did on the way in. I grabbed a bowl and slopped in a big dollop of sour cream to cut the pain down to human levels. I was stirring it into the chili and still had the tub of sour cream in my hand, and that's when I noticed the expiration date on it. July 10th, 1983. The current date was sometime in August 1994. I called the duty cook over to question why they were serving something more than a decade past its expiration date. He just shrugged and explained those date things were more suggestions than rules. I thought about it for a second and ate the chili. Still here 25 years later, so I guess he was right. Then there was the run on the Bolivar, SSBN 641, where the supply officer decided to cut costs by stocking some nobody ever heard of their brand of catsup that, quite frankly, tasted like watered down tomato soup. A week underway it was discovered, as in the cooks ratted them out, that the wardroom officer's mess had 15 cases of Heinz. Cue the mid-watch surgical strike that opened all of the Heinz bottles, drained their life-giving tomato goodness and refilled them with the no-name dreck. The Heinz went into the no-name bottles and the crew called it a win, while the CHOP supply officer got endless crap from the officers for the low-quality stuff he had foisted off on the wardroom. One of the joys of being a submariner is watching riders freak out. Claustrophobia is hilarious to those of you who don't have it. During the sea and anchor detail, heading out of port on the surface, I ended up escorting an Air Force LT colonel around the boat because he wanted a tour and didn't want to spend any time with the inspection team he was leading. So I took him to all the parts of the boat he was cleared for and listened to his stories about how the Air Force silo missiles did the real deterrence with their 2-week tours. I didn't laugh while he could see me. Anyway, I took him to the machinery 2 hatch to hand him off to the ZO for the dive. The ZO was explaining what was happening. The guy's topside came below, the hatch was sealed, and the guy freaked out completely. Like a total panic attack. The dive was cancelled, the topside guys went back up to rig the deck for surface ops, and a boat was called to come get the gentleman after he handed command of the inspection team to his senior subordinate. And the ZO yelled at me for making him laugh. Watch is the backbone of life on board a sub. The day is broken up into 4 6-hour periods. I hear there are 3 8-hour periods now. Each of these is a watch in which a group of people, a watch team or watch section, are assigned parts of the boat, watch stations, to men based on their rating or job to watch. What they do during their watch is dependent on their watch station, which I'll get to in a second. Typically there are 3 watch sections that rotate at the end of each period. So A will stand 0000200600, then B will come on for 0600 to 1200, then C will come on for 1200 to 1800, then A is back on from 1800 to 0000. Rinse and repeat for 100 days or so, or however long fast attacks go out for, like 2 days, before they hit a port. I don't know. Point anyways. While on watch they maintain their watch station and perform the job functions assigned to them. Examples: sonar techs listen for sheet, anything, other vessels, aquatic life, even their own boat making too much noise, drop a wrench in the bilge and expect a call telling you to quiet the fuck down. Reactor operators watch and control the parameters of the reactor under the supervision of the engineering officer of the watch. A commissioned officer. Point helmsman and planesman drive the boat based on orders from the officer in the con on watch with them. Point engine room supervisors wander around the engine room keeping an eye on all the watchstanders and shooting the sheet for the most part, but occasionally help out if things need getting done. The engine room lower level watch is stuck in the lower level of the engine room for his 6 hours operating equipment down there like lube oil purifiers, strainers, and water pumps. The list goes on and on. Point generally watch stations have some sort of hourly log they maintain, where they walk around checking and recording parameters of equipment and compare it to acceptable values. There are dozens of these watch stations constantly manned 24/7 while the boat is underway. And 90% of the time they're not actually doing anything but sitting around making sure all the equipment is running within spec point. Once a watch team gets off watch, they are called off going for 6 hours. The 6 hours before their watch, they are called oncoming. They do your job during these 2 periods, preferably offgoing, which is everything else. Cleaning, training, running drills, responding to fake fires, fake floods, etc., maintenance, laundry, etc. Some of the boats are on a normal 24-hour workday, mainly the higher-ranking officers, and enlisted personnel like the captain, ZO, engineer, weapons officer, chief of the boat, engineering department master chief, etc. They administer their respective departments. So things like drills and training are generally during like 0700 to 1600, so sometimes a watch team, like the one getting off at midnight, sleeps off going because they are going to support drills during their oncoming time point. Everything not taken up by watch or work is used to sleep or for entertainment. This is all for 18 days. I don't know anything about the 24-hour day thing they do now.